Hi, everybody. I'm Al Filreis. I'm the faculty director of this institution, the Kelly Writers House. Thank you for coming. Thank you for braving the rain. Thank you for braving Maskville and all the things that you're braving to be here. It's an amazing season for in-person events. It's like on one hand, everybody wants to come. On the other hand, everybody's a little squeamish. So you are wonderful people for coming. We have a pretty big YouTube audience. I want to say hi to them. Pretty much, Dana and Emily, when you're talking to the YouTube people, you just have to point up that way and wave at them. And we, not only are we happy that you folks, the people watching us on our live stream, are there, but we also take seriously what you are chatting about. So our friends who are running the tech tonight will be watching the chat. And at a certain point, and I'm going to remind Emily of this, at a certain point when we're talking and doing Q&A and having a discussion, we might call on you guys in the back to tell us about an interesting question that's being posted there, or really just comments. So I'll remind you of that, Emily. Okay, so thank you for coming. The first thing we need to do is to put our hands together to welcome Dana Stevens back to the University of Pennsylvania. Yay, Dana! I'm going to say this is visit number 3, I think, or 2 anyway. So it's good to have you back here in Philadelphia. And this is Emily Wilson. I think most of you know Emily. Let's thank Emily for coming down Locust Walk. So you're in for a treat. Everybody's in for a treat. Live stream people, you're in for a treat. But the treats I'm about to describe are not for you necessarily. We have a letterpress printed broadside that celebrates this event, and we are giving these away. These are free, and I hope you'll get one. And in fact, I'm sure Dana wouldn't be opposed to signing this thing. It's a limited edition. This is number 18 out of 32. And I'm just going to give it to you to hold on to it, so you have one of those. But more importantly, we have copies of Dana's book, which you're about to hear a lot about. I read it about almost a month ago, and I loved every minute, every page. It's really a remarkable thing, and we're about to hear more about its remarkableness. This book is available at our cost in the back, and I know that during the reception, Dana will be very happy, probably standing here, sitting here, somewhere here in the front, and would be happy to inscribe your copy. Okay, so make sure that you get a copy of the book. So what's going to happen now is that Emily and Dana are going to come up here, and they're going to be involved in a presentation. At a certain point, we will turn it to you for your questions and comments, and we'll be using this portable mic to record your questions so that the people watching the live stream can hear. Okay? All right, one more time. This is really going to be exciting. Put your hands together for these two. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Al, for the lovely introduction, and thank you all for being here both on YouTube and in person for this wonderful event, which I know will be a wonderful event because Dana is both a wonderful writer and a wonderful speaker. And so I guess I wanted to start the conversation by asking you, Dana, to talk a little bit about the book as a work of writing, because I came to it not as a Keaton head, but as a fan of Dana's writing in Slate and on the Culture Gabfest, and also as somebody interested in cultural history more broadly. So I was interested in this book as a book that sort of tries to tell the history of the 20th century, as its subtitle suggests, through the work of Buster Keaton. So I'd love to just hear you talk a little bit about the, I think, very unusual and sort of genre-busting way that this book is structured as a series of 27 chapters, so it's more than an epic, it has more than 24 books, that sort of focuses not just on the white male protagonist, but also in every chapter there's this very elegant way that you take on a new character, including a pancake house, including the dawn of film criticism, the dawn of child abuse laws. Every chapter has a sort of essayistic slant on a new element in the 20th century. So talk to us a little bit about the ways this isn't a biography.
Yeah, I feel like I say this at the beginning of every event, and I'm glad that you're welcoming it rather than making it be an apologetic disclaimer that I have to issue, where it's almost like a caveat emptor, like if you buy this book, you will not be buying a soup to nuts history of the life of Buster Keaton. And that's especially good to know because there's a brand new book out about Keaton that is a much more traditional, conventional biography that's also about twice as long as this book. And if you want to know everything that happened basically in every week of Buster Keaton's life, every contract he ever signed, just really an exhaustive and very well researched traditional biography. That one is out there. It's by James Curtis, but this is a very different story. And I'm interested to talk to you, Emily, about genre and how you see it, and other books that tell life stories in different ways as occupying a different genre. Because the fact is, if this isn't a biography, what shelf should it be shelved on? I'm happy for it to be sold as a biography if that makes people notice it. But I guess I would think of it more as a critical study or a cultural history. That's probably the best word for what it is. And a sort of thumbnail phrase that I came up with that I think is useful. It was certainly useful to me in going about writing it, is that it's a history of a time period as much as a person. It's a history of Buster Keaton's lifespan as much of his life, and as much as his life and his lifespan went from 1895, which is a year that becomes kind of obsessively important in the book because I start seeing all of these things in American culture swirling around the year of 1895. And his life ends in 1966, which also happens to be the year I was born. And 1895 just happens to be, as I mentioned in the book and in the dedication, the year my oldest grandparent was born, my father's father, who was an older father. So, his life reaches back into the 19th century. And if you think about that span of time and everything that happened in America and the world, and technology and entertainment and all the fields that I talk about between 1895 and 1966, you can just see that there's a lot of stories to be told there. There's a lot of ways to divide that span of 70 years, not an incredibly long life to live, the biblical 70, but so much happened to him during it and so much happened to the world during it. So that was sort of the idea for the framing. And that came really before the idea of writing the book. The obsession with that time period really came from 20 years or so of just being really interested in Keaton, which then expanded into being interested in silent film and the context it was made in. And suddenly, next thing I knew, it was sort of, there's a new Louis B. Mayer biography. I better read that. Or, there's a history of rail travel in the turn of the century. And all of those things just seemed to me to fit together in a way. So I guess the book was trying to sort out how they seemed to fit together.
I mean, to me, it seems an extremely original and unusual piece of creative nonfiction in that it doesn't actually, fit very neatly into the categories that publishers are of course, going to fit it into. In that, I was interested, as you were talking just then, about how you focused both on this not particularly long by the standards of mortality, but also enormous for giving a whole history in less than 400 pages of this history of 70 years, but then also your own life, that it actually interweaves an element of memoir along with cultural history, along with, I think, very precise and subtle film criticism, which of course is something you're fantastic at, but then also cultural history. So I'm interested in, do you have any models in terms of, are there any other books out there that do all of these things? Because I have trouble thinking of a book that does quite as many different things at the same time as this one does.
I mean, there are books that do it better, I think, but it is an unusual thing to try to do with a book. The book that inspired me, and that at the beginning of the project I would cite to people in pitch meetings and things like that. There weren't a lot of pitch meetings with this book. I mean, it really just sort of found the right editor and found a home, and then went from there. But if I had to sit in a room with someone who knew nothing about Keaton or me and tell them about the book that I would mention would be this book called River of Shadows by Rebecca Solnit. I don't know if anybody here knows that book, from 2007, 2008, something like that. And it is about the life story of Edward Muybridge, the photographer who famously photographed the running horses, for Leland Stanford, on this bet, this idea that they were trying to figure out if a horse's hooves all leave the ground at the same time. And he arranged a kind of tripwire photography setup where he could take sequential pictures of the horses, and that's often cited as one of the precursors to cinema, right? Because it's like a flip book style. But Edward Muybridge had also not incredibly long, but incredibly bizarre and exciting life that involved, a murder trial and photographing the last Native American reservation in California that was sort of being cleared out by the California state government at the time, photographing the railroad as it made its way far west. He, changed his identity. He was born in England and, sort of radically transformed himself into this character to come to the U.S. I can't even get into everything that was amazing about Edward Muybridge's life, but the way Solnit tells his story is to do something a little bit like you were saying, to make each chapter sort of a freestanding essay. This one's about the railroad. This one is about disappearing reservations. This one is about, scandal and tabloids and murder trials at the turn of the century. And telling his life that way just became about so much more than him, and coming away from that book, I'm not sure that I can remember the chronicle of Muybridge's life as well as I can remember just the portrait that she gives of technology in a time not that different from the time I'm writing about, a little earlier, but similarly, roiled by all these technological changes and so forth. So I think I was already well into my Keaton obsession by the time I read that book, but the idea of using that form to try to enter into his life probably came from reading her.
Mm-hmm. So we should definitely talk about Keaton as well as about form, and as well as about the form of the book. And maybe a place to start would be his relationship with his father and the initial Three Keatons act. And I'm wondering if you could just start off by telling us a little bit about that, but then about how the father-son theme sort of runs through Keaton's work.
Right.
Because I guess I'm coming to this partly thinking comedy has always been about generational conflict ever since the time of Aristophanes and the son beating up the father in the clouds. And it's a theme that sort of runs through Roman comedy. It runs through a lot of 19th century literature. Also has this theme of generational conflict. So I would love to just have you talk a little bit about how Keaton gives a different slant on all of that.
Yeah, when you were talking about father-son conflict, I thought of Hamlet on the one hand and The Simpsons on the other hand. And in a way, Keaton's relationship with his father brings in elements of all of that. It has these tragic elements and dramatic elements that really come out in, for example, his film Steamboat Bill Jr., that is explicitly about the relationship between a son and father. And really the drama of that movie is them working out their relationship. But of course, it's happening against the backdrop of, tornadoes and falling houses and people, being rescued from rivers and things like that. But really what it is about is a father-son reconciliation. But the Three Keatons act that young Buster grew up doing with his parents traveling around the vaudeville circuits was more like the Simpsons relationship. Really the central joke of his and his father Joe's, dynamic on stage was a lot like Homer Simpson and Bart Simpson. It was this mischievous pest of a boy who would pester his father on stage and goad him to the point that the father, who usually started off the act with this ironically intended ballad or poem that he would recite about gentle parenting and how it's important to be forbearing with our children, and that would all be a setup for this backstage dramatic irony, that we the spectator would see Buster doing something, devising something that was going to somehow knock his father over or, whack him in the face with a basketball or something. And as soon as that happened, it became a conflagration of father-son violence in a way that was really extreme. And they were regarded as the most violent act in vaudeville, certainly the most violent family act in vaudeville. And as I write about a lot in the book, the laughter that accompanied the Three Keatons was always accompanied by gasps and terror. And that was kind of part of the act, right? What audiences came for was to witness the acrobatic feats that this little boy could do and laugh at the kind of general mayhem, but also to be horrified that anyone could survive such a thing. And as a result, there was also a constant battle between the Keatons and the Society for the Protection, Prevention of Cruelty to Children, the SPCC, which was a fairly newly formed organization at the time, which I get into it in the book. It was about 20 years old. And it seems like Elbridge Gerry, who was the founder and at that time the head of the society, took a special, I don't know about dislike, but he took a special interest in shutting down the Keatons Act. I think he thought it was setting a really bad example for what children on stage should be doing. He didn't think there should be children on stage performing at all. And so the Keatons were constantly being followed when in New York State, the only place that the SPCC had jurisdiction then, in an attempt to shut down their act. But they remained the most popular family act on the circuits anyway, and kind of found ways around that throughout those years. And much later, Keaton always vehemently denied that his childhood had been abusive. But by our modern standards, it's pretty hard to look at the way he was treated as the way that you would want to bring up your child. He never got to go to school. He was constantly on the road, and he performed twice a day in this really brutal act that a couple of times landed him in the hospital, although he was remarkably resilient and not injured nearly as often as it seems like he would have been.
Right, and especially as you bring out, increasingly the father who was hurling him around was drunk, and you'd think that would make it even more dangerous, and that the horror would become greater and greater.
And that's exactly what happened, and that's why the act broke up when it did. I mean, it seems like, there's nobody was keeping a diary of this, so there's not an exact chronology of it, but it seems like it was in Keaton's teens specifically that his father's kind of social drinking, his kind of tendency to drink too much and occasionally get in a fight and land in jail, started to be more turned on the family, and that in part, I think it was that the act was harder to do because his son was growing up and getting bigger and harder to throw around. Joe was getting older and did not like getting older, so there was a lot of repressed rage. But for whatever reason, there started to be a period in Buster's teens where the act was more dangerous to Buster's mother as well, who was also, I think, subject to some abuse from her husband. So there's a very dramatic scene that occurs in 1916, 17, around that time, which is in the book too, where Buster's mother turns to him on a train as they're riding to their next gig and says, "We need to break up the act. I can't go on like this anymore." And Buster, who had always, throughout his life, been a pretty passive figure, he doesn't take a lot of initiative, and he's a terrible businessman and makes all kinds of decisions that make his career suffer because of that, and his life suffer. Because his mother asked him to, and because she was the one who was suffering, he was willing to do it, and he broke up the act at that time. And that's the moment that, somewhat by mistake, he ended up moving into film instead of the stage.
Which then sort of leads to this technical problem of what does he do once he doesn't have somebody to hurl him around anymore? And also then how does he deal with this new medium of moving from stage to film, and what are both the opportunities and also the challenges of that new medium?
Right.
So maybe I guess one possible way to lead from where we were is to talk about the new medium, but then also to talk about how he had this very problematic and violent home and life, but then he recreates the violence of home by having home fall on top of him, literally, and over and over and over.
Right.
And I think that's the way we're going to go in terms of the clips. So that might be a possible way to set up
this is a good way to lead into the clips we were going to look at. But it seems like, and I think these two things weave together really well, that two obsessions throughout his career that he does in film after film after film is that he has some sort of confrontation with an authority figure, sometimes an actual father, sometimes a kind of stand-in for a father, or it might be the father of the girl that he likes, the stern dad who doesn't want him dating his daughter. Joe Roberts in his early movies, who's in one of the clips we're about to see, or at least he's in the movie that the clip is from, was this big barrel-chested vaudevillian that he knew from childhood that he used as a kind of father surrogate, right? Because Joe was taller than Buster and bigger, but this guy was really tall and big and made him look tiny. And so he would find a male, larger surrogate to throw him around in some way and kind of judge him, and look askance on him. But he actually started to expand that as his budgets got bigger and his imagination started to have more free reign in his movies, so that it wasn't just an individual who was throwing him around. It was some kind of force, right? It could be weather, like the tornadoes and various rainstorms that bash him around, or it could be things like collapsing houses or sinking boats. He found something about his environment that would be a punishing force, So there's a kind of sadomasochistic play at work there, because what the audience is seeing and enjoying seeing is this hapless small man being beset upon by all these huge forces, and yet having a still face in the storm, just as he was famous for as a child, that he would land from whatever he'd been hurled into and come up with a straight face. And that dynamic just kept on happening in his films, but it wasn't a repetition, really. And that's what we'll see in the clips, because he was always expanding and kind of exploring more with those gags.
So do you want to set up the clips? Should we
Sure.
turn to the
Yeah.
clips? Yes.
I mean, just by way of showing the evolution of a gag, because I think this is fun to watch. We can watch. I mean, if there's one Keaton gag that everybody knows, that's endlessly gifted and repeated on every social media channel, it's the giant house front that collapses on him in Steamboat Bill Jr. But that's pretty late in his silent career. That's in 1927. He made that movie. I think it came out in 1928. And so by that time, he'd already been refining this gag for almost 10 years. So I thought we would start with the first time he uses something like that. This is actually from a Keaton Arbuckle collaboration. So this is the apprenticeship stage of his career in the late teens. It's 1917 through 1920, basically, when he's working with Roscoe Arbuckle, better known as Fatty Arbuckle, who is officially the director of the films, but at this point they were really partners and co-directing them together. And And you see a first version of that gag in a movie called Backstage from 1919. So 1919 is the year that Keaton gets out of Army service. He's just finished his service in World War I, which was not really, he never saw any action. He was an entertainer, and the war had essentially already ended when he got to France. So he had spent 7 or 8 months there entertaining the troops that were waiting to be shipped home. And as he gets back from that, he and Arbuckle make their first post-service movie together, which is Backstage. And it's a kind of movie Keaton loved to make because he grew up on stages and behind stages. So he loved these kind of stories that were about the artifice of theater and so forth. So here's a moment from Backstage where you see Arbuckle's character trying to serenade a young lady on stage and then getting crushed by a flat. Oh, we need some ukulele music in the background. So he's the stagehand messing things up. All right, that's enough for that one. So that gives you the idea. So that incorporates a lot of things that Keaton was obsessed with and that you see in many, many of his movies. You know, props and backstage, settings, settings that appear to be one thing and they're then another thing. There's several scenes in Keaton movies where you see somebody having an experience, a dramatic, kind of melodramatic experience, and then it turns out to be a play. And somebody comes in and carries the wall away, and suddenly you realize it was all fake, right? So this is a little bit playing with something like that. But you also just see that it's not that dangerous of a gag. I mean, it's a little stage flat. The worst thing that could have happened would be, you know, maybe it would break over his head or something like that. But this isn't a gag that's dealing with danger. It's just simply the clever idea, you know, what if you were standing geometrically in the right spot that you went through the window? And it may be that was an old vaudeville thing. I mean, maybe somebody who knows more about stage history than me could say, oh, well, this used to always happen on vaudeville stages. Maybe it did. But it's what Keaton does with it and how he keeps developing it that's interesting and fun. So the next clip comes from a movie in 1920. And to trace the evolution of Keaton's career up to here, now he has his own studio. He's basically inherited Arbuckle's studio because Arbuckle goes on to make feature comedies. So this is his first release from his own studio, but the Buster Keaton studio. It's in 1920, just a year after the one we just saw. But even though it's just a year later, there's clearly a lot more happening in Keaton's brain as far as what he wants to accomplish with a gag. So the idea of 1 week, if you haven't seen it, and you should because it really is one of the great American comedies. There was a conversation going on today on Twitter about the greatest romantic comedies because there was a list that was posted on Vulture, is that where it was? And people were complaining that there weren't enough classic films on it. There weren't any silent films on it. I think 1 week is one of the great romantic comedies of the 20th century. It's just a perfect little 20-minute film. But anyway, what's happening here is this couple is trying to build a house together from a home kit, like a Sears Roebuck style, you know, kit that would get shipped to your home. Just something else I write about in the book because it was a real craze at the time. And the bad guy, who is actually in love with the bride and wishes he had married her, evilly switches the numbers on the boxes of lumber that they're supposed to put together. And so the house they make ends up being this crazy, you know, Cabinet of Dr. Caligari kind of house of horrors. So this is early on before they really discover that, as they're cheerfully trying to build their house together. All right, that's good. Thank you, Zach. So there's a little bit more ingenuity behind it. They didn't just throw together a really quick stage flat to throw on Arbuckle, but they had to actually build this custom house, and that's something that becomes more and more important as Keaton's career goes on. This particular movie didn't have the production designer Fred Gabori, who became Keaton's big right-hand man, the guy who created all these incredible things like The Falling House and Steamboat Bill. But he was already trying to get, trying to get into that idea of having these strange custom sets built that did weird, interesting things. And also there, I think you see more character being developed, right? I mean, One Week is really a great movie because it's a movie about the relationship between this young couple and these newlyweds building a house together. It's one of the Keaton movies in which a woman, his romantic lead, has the most agency and power and is really collaborating with him on trying to do this impossible thing of build this crazy house. And she's not just a helpmate, but really a true partner in the action. So she's also a partner in the stunt action, which is something I love about that moment, that they both get a part in the stunt. But now let's fast forward to 1927 when he's making Steamboat Bill Jr. and really taking this gag as far as it can go. And I put a little bit more extra around it so you can see that famous falling house isn't just an isolated stunt, but it's happening in the midst of this whole mad swirl of other stunts. Just gonna let this run a minute because it's so good. Oh my God. All right, we can stop there. Oh, and then if you wanted to see it, there's some more of his fascination with the stage. He goes into this ruined theater just for the simple purpose of finding as many gags as he possibly can backstage, like getting scared by a ventriloquism puppet that he finds and all this stuff. But there, yeah, you really start to see a second theme, which I hope we get into, that I think ties in with this dad-son power struggle that he was always reenacting, which is dwellings that fall apart and places that can't be trusted, whether it's boats that sink or houses that fall on you, or the house he builds in 1 week that kind of betrays him by being reduced to a pile of lumber at the end of the movie. And it seems like, again, this was something that Keaton was not trying to symbolize anything with. It was just he actually enjoyed the physics of it, and I think didn't quite realize the extent to which it was a thematic expression of something in his own life. But yeah, there's no dwelling that is to be trusted or no structure that's to be trusted in a Keaton movie. They're all sort of waiting to fall apart or fly into bits. And that seems like it echoes lots of things, which if you read the book, you'll see were true in his real life, that he grew up on trains and never had a fixed abode really in his whole childhood, that his first marriage was marked by all of these, real estate flips. He was constantly trying to please his first wife by buying nicer and nicer houses, or a house that she wanted, or a place where they could be happy together, and they were never happy. And finally he built her, one of the most legendary Hollywood mansions of the 1920s, and they were miserable there. And I feel like in some ways his life was about the search for that kind of abode, which he really didn't find in his own life until he was about 60 with his third wife, when they finally moved into, a house in San Fernando Valley where they were comfortable, and he spent the rest of his life, and he raised chickens and grew fruit, and seemed like he was moving towards something that was the stability that he'd always been seeking.
I mean, those clips, I think, already give you this sense of just how resonant with what seem like symbols or metaphors Keaton's work is, and how it can be very hard to sort of restrain oneself from thinking, clearly this is about climate change, clearly this is an apocalypse, clearly this is all about consumer capitalism, this has got to be about the war, this has got to be about the Depression, or all these different ways that it seems to be an analysis of the state of America in the 1920s. And I think part of what became clear to me in the book was just how resistant Keaton was to doing the sort of either Chaplin-esque, let me moralize to camera, or what he then got sort of forced into in the Hollywood system of doing a sort of schmaltzy, let me moralize, or let me make it an explicitly happy ending, or this is going to mean something. And that part of what's so great about him is that he doesn't want it to mean anything. So I guess I would love to hear more from you about just the Keaton who wants to be an engineer and who doesn't necessarily want the grand symbols to sort of be spelled out, and that in a way those grand symbols are the better for not being spelled out. I mean, I guess maybe part of where I'm going with this is just that it was a surprise to me to realize that at the end of his life, or later on, that he has this connection with Beckett. And it seems like a surprising connection, that why would the sort of ultra highbrow and the not highbrow, not a reader kind of Keaton have had this connection? And part of it seems like it's to do with this sort of pure focus on art and technique, and that he was interested in the technique and how do I get something to work within this world, and that actually generates symbols in a way that if you're trying to generate symbols, you might not. Like you're going to make lame symbols if you try to generate them. Whereas if you don't try to make symbols, you just try to make things move in space, then the symbols may come.
Yeah. It's something that really fascinated me the whole time I was researching this, is that I can't think of any artist as great who was never trying to be an artist, and who really didn't consider himself one, and was not modestly trying to deny that he was one, but just did not conceive of himself in that way. I think he saw himself as a comedian and a craftsman of laughs. He was asked late in life if he had had more education, because he had none whatsoever formally, what he might have liked to do. And he said, I think I would have liked to be a civil engineer. And if you think about his films, he is essentially a civil engineer. I mean, in the general, he and his crew built an entire train bridge to a trestle so that their train could be wrecked in exactly the way they wanted it to be wrecked. A lot of his big shoots were really feats of engineering. And I think you're right that what he's setting out to do always has to do with physics and gravity. There's character involved, certainly, and it's important that it takes place in a human world with relationships. But he's not trying to symbolize. Certainly when he made Steamboat Bill Jr. about a father-son relationship on this boat, he wasn't thinking, how can I find analogies for their relationship in, these gags and in what I'm doing with the boat? No, he was much more interested in the boat itself. And it seems like all of those other things almost work themselves out in an unconscious way in the work. I mean, I'm not saying at all that he was some spontaneous talent that wasn't putting thought into things. Everything was meticulously planned, but he did not think abstractly about his work, and he didn't like to talk abstractly about it, and always really shied away from interviewers who wanted to ask him, what did you mean? You're a genius. Any kind of talk like that, it made him clam up.
So we should talk a little bit about the later stages of his life. And I mean, I think that one of the many ways that your book is original is that it doesn't sort of follow the usual, he was so great when in the era of silent film, and then he was drunk all the time and it was a tragic decline, and the end, how sad. And you sort of show us that, in fact, it was much more complicated than that, and that he was only drunk for about 2 years. And then after that, he kind of pulled himself together, and that, I mean, maybe related to what you were saying, that he was very much not a snobbish figure. He didn't actually necessarily think, only if I'm making great movies will my life be worthwhile. He did great stuff in television. He did great stuff in clowning. So maybe just tell us a little bit about the later stages of Keaton's life, and we can't do the whole of the last decades, but some details from the last part of the book.
Yeah, that part was important to me. I mean, I also don't want to gloss over the dark years of his life at all. And I think they were very influential on later years in the sense that there is certainly a sadness that he was never able to direct a film again. You know, I mean, there could have been so many opportunities, even if he wasn't in front of the camera, for him to have been a great director behind the camera. He had such a great sense of where to place it, and really just excellent taste as a director and an editor. He edited all his own films too. So certainly a huge amount of talent was wasted by the fact that he became more of a performer in the second half of his life. But I think it's completely wrong to look at it as a biopic style, you know, a Hollywood biopic style descent, which is really what the very bad biopic about him made in 1957 kind of did. You know, it was very popular at the time to tell the stories of washed up movie stars, and in part because alcoholism was just starting to become something that was talked about openly, and some actors and actresses who had struggled with alcohol were starting to come out and talk about it, and Billy Wilder's The Lost Weekend had come out and made it sort of a more acceptable thing to talk about. Also, AA was getting its start, which I write about in the book. But he didn't really benefit from any of that. You know, he certainly found work from 1937 or so on. There were a few years, I would say basically 1933, the year he's fired from MGM, until sort of the mid to late 30s, that he was floundering. You know, he stopped drinking, not completely, but he became roughly sober in 1935, floundered around for a while, became a gag writer at MGM, which was, you know, a behind the scenes, much lower paid job at the place where he just a few years before had been the top comedy star. So that certainly must have felt like a come down. But at the same time, he liked to work. You know, he had a hugely powerful work ethic. He really didn't like to be idle. And he had, I feel like, almost a drive, you know, an obsessive drive to make people laugh and to help other people make people laugh and to craft comedy in whatever way he could. And you're also right that with the coming of television, you know, he actually started to emerge from even that obscurity and get back in front of the camera again and, you know, start to be beloved by a new generation of people who might not have even known him as a silent star, who just thought of him as the funny guy who was on Ed Sullivan and things like that all the time. But yeah, the second half of his life, the last third, I guess, of his life was full of all kinds of interesting work projects that he did, including working in a French circus, which was really, really fun to research and write about. I actually interviewed a French clown for the book, who's in his 60s now and runs a clowning school and is kind of a clowning historian. And he's dedicated his whole life to clowning and the history of clowning. Why did he become a clown? Because when he was 9 years old, his father took him to see Buster Keaton at the Cirque Medrano, this little circus that he performed at for a few years in Paris. And he was just absolutely blown away and just decided, you know, this is it for me. This is what clowning is, and it's what I have to do. You know, so that makes me really melancholy not to be able to travel back in time and see those performances. Though there's a tiny little clip of one of those French circus performances you can find on YouTube. But yeah, then working with Samuel Beckett, someone who he absolutely did not understand, and you know, kind of rolled his eyes at the very avant-garde short film they made together. But when the film came out, it was not very well received on the Beckett side. Critics thought that it was obscure and incomprehensible and kind of mocked it. But it was very well received in terms of being a vehicle for this beloved star who everybody was so happy to see again. And there's a story of it being shown at the Venice Film Festival in 1965. Just a few months before Keaton died. He didn't know that he was dying at that point. And the movie itself was panned, but when he got up, he got a standing ovation and, you know, came to the podium with tears in his eyes and gave a very brief, laconic, Buster Keaton style, you know, thank you speech, and just made it really clear that I think he understood. You know, I think he died understanding that he would be remembered. Maybe not to the degree that he was remembered and to the degree of reverence we hold him in now, but that makes me happy, you know, that he didn't die feeling, oh, I'm dying in obscurity and my career was a ruin. I don't think he felt that at all.
So, I mean, just picking up on your interview with the clown, I'd love to know more about the process for researching the book, and in particular, like finishing it during the pandemic. Were there more clowns that you wanted to go visit that you didn't get to see because it was COVID? Or
yeah, there were very specific clowns. I mean, it wasn't all COVID's fault either. There's a French clown named Pierre Ete who was extremely influenced by Keaton, and who said, I've heard in interviews say some of the smartest things I've ever heard said about him. And I really wanted to interview him, but he died right before I could. James Karen, who is a character actor who's also a wonderful friend of Keaton's and has such insight when he talks about him in interviews, also died before I could talk to him. But the pandemic is related to that because, you know, when the pandemic came in, all of these things I had planned to do, research trips, even just going to libraries in my own city, And then things like chasing people down for interviews became strangely much harder to do. I mean, not strange that the libraries were closed. We all know why that was, but it was also hard to get through people's publicists when the pandemic started. I wanted to talk to Jackie Chan, the martial artist, comedian who's so influenced by Keaton, who I'm sure would be wonderful to talk to about him. But once you don't have anything to promote, as during a pandemic, it's kind of hard to get through your publicity team and say, hi, I'm writing a book. You've never heard of me. Please let me talk to the world's most famous martial arts superstar. So that never happened. Yeah. And I think I was telling you earlier, when I look at the book, I see this very noticeable seam from the moment the pandemic started and primary research became harder to do. But no reader has noticed it yet, so I guess I got away with it. But there are definitely places I would have gone, specific libraries and archives. There's an actual box at the New York Public Performing Arts Library that I remember that was all about his dark period. It was clipping files from the period when he married May Scriven, that kind of dodgy sobriety nurse that he married that was his second wife, and he was floundering and drinking too much, and it was this really depressing looking but really important seeming clipping file box. But I wasn't anywhere near there. I was still doing his childhood. And so I thought, that's going to be great. When I get to that stage of the book, New York Performing Arts Library, here I come. But there was no library by that time. So I think like anybody writing a book, but maybe the pandemic makes it worse, you have to make decisions based on what's available to you, So
Which in a way seems so fitting for the book itself. I mean, for Keaton, because of course he's always working with the materials available.
He's all about resourcefulness.
He's all about
it's
resourcefulness and surviving in the terrible environment out to get you, which is what we've all been doing over the last few years.
Yeah, I feel like it ended up being the book that it was meant to be, and the things that I had to leave out, I found workarounds and maybe discovered other things that I wouldn't have done.
Yeah. I think I'm realizing that we have run out of the time we said we'd take before we open it up. So are there questions from the audience or comments or questions from the YouTubers that people want to bring up? You should feel free to raise your hand if you want to ask something, comment something.
Hi, Dana. Thanks.
Hey.
I enjoyed your book a lot. Thank you for writing it.
Great.
My question is about what you were talking about earlier about his growing up in this vaudeville act. He was the kid that was being tossed around by his dad mostly. He never decided to add kids into his movies, as far as I can remember. And I mean, clearly that was a successful avenue. Chaplin did it with The Kid and was a huge movie. Why do you think that was? Why did he never sort of turn the tables and become the dad instead of always being sort of the smaller? I mean, it was clearly because he was small and could play that childlike character. But was there anything that kept him from, making another person, bringing another kid into the act, for example?
Yeah, interesting. He came close. He does have a movie called The Boat, one of his shorts, that's in a way is sort of a sequel to 1 Week. It has Sybil Seeley, my favorite of his leading ladies, the one who goes up high on the hinged wall. He had this idea at one point that he would make a series of comedies with her that would be sort of about that same couple going through different phases of their marriage. And in The Boat, they have 2 children, 2 small boys. And he once in a while, the boys are not great acrobats or anything, but once in a while he handles them in a way that seems reminiscent of how his dad might have handled him. He's kind of grabbing them by their belts and carrying them around like suitcases and things like that. But that's the one time I can think of he really does kid comedy. When he was fired from MGM, actually, the next movie on his docket to make was going to be with Jimmy Durante, who they had paired him with as this really unfortunate comedy team that didn't work at all, and with Jackie, I was going to say Jackie Coogan, but it's not. It's Jackie Cooper, who was a 10-year-old child star at the time. So and it was going to be called Buddies. So I don't know what that would have been, but there was a movie in the offing with him kind of palling around with a kid. I agree. It kind of seems like a natural. And I think that I have all these theories about what if he could have kept making movies, but I have a feeling that he might have turned the tables in that way, because Steamboat Bill feels so much to me, and I write about this in the book, as kind of tying the knot on a certain set of anxieties about fatherhood and sonhood. It seems like it's resolving some of those conflicts in a way, and that he might have been ready to cast himself as the father in a movie, but he never did.
We have a question from the YouTube stream. It's from Jacob Pollock. And Dana, in order to read it, I have to bend down a little bit.
Okay.
Okay. The book says that Robert Sherwood's review of Keaton's 3 Ages pushes film criticism in a new direction and he brings events outside the theater to bear on his experience inside it. From your book. Here's the question. What were film reviews like prior to Sherwood's analysis? And then looking to today, how do you review a film? Are you like Sherwood, who uses themes and events from outside the movie to write a review? There's a lot to answer there. Pick anything.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in answer to the first question, not to send you all to the store to buy the book, but I talk about exactly that, about what film criticism was like before, not just Sherwood, but James Agee and the other critics I write about who, you know, kind of made film criticism what we think of it as now, which is, I think, I mean, I've heard many critics say this, is when you're writing movie reviews, you're kind of writing about the whole world, right? I mean, movies are about the whole world. So, you know, you're folding in your knowledge of things from outside. And I don't think anybody now would really flock to reading a film critic who only locked themselves inside writing about movies in relation to other movies, right? I mean, the whole idea is that you're a thinker and you're thinking through movies. But that wasn't always the way film criticism was. And so I trace that genealogy a little bit in my book and talk about how before the 1920s, which is when Robert Sherwood, this great critic for Life magazine, who loved Keaton most of the time, although he had some serious reservations about some of his films, before he started writing, and some other critics who, you know, started to open things up more in that way, film criticism was a strange combination of sort of fan service, right? Something we're still very familiar with, the kind of fan magazine. There were all kinds of magazines like Motion Picture Story that I write about that were really almost fantasy spaces, you know, for people who were obsessed with these figures in this new exciting medium and wanted to know more about them and wanted to know who they were. Because in the very early days of film, until the mid-1910s or so, producers did not put cast lists on movies. So you'd see a movie and you would have no idea who this star was. And so you'd write a letter to Motion Picture Story magazine saying, who is the, you know, girl with the brunette bob in, you know, whatever the movie was. And maybe you would get the response, maybe you wouldn't, because Biograph didn't allow their stars to be shared. So yeah, there was almost this culture of secrecy about who the stars were. And that was the producer's attempt to keep the stars from asking for bigger salaries and for becoming free agents and moving to other houses and things like that. It didn't work. Mary Pickford and others were such big stars that they soon took the lead and started, you know, dictating the terms of their own careers. But yeah, film criticism sort of was a mixture of fan service and trade gossip and things like that, and then just very, very basic blurbs describing what a movie was with practically no evaluation. And it was a good long time. I mean, it was, you know, it was 25 years into the existence of movies before there started to be something like what theater criticism had been for a long time, you know, a real critical discourse and specific names that you would associate. You know, you would go to Life because you wanted to hear Bob Sherwood's take on the latest movies. And it really shocked me to see how recent that was, you know, and to see how I and other film critics, like my colleague Sam Adams in the audience, we're really the descendants of people like Sherwood and Agee and, you know, those critics that started to bring their own voice to it.
Anybody else have comments, questions as the Zoom got...
There's another one
Yes.
from YouTube, but
Yeah.
I want to defer to the room if there's a question here. I know Sam Adams has questions coming out of his ears.
Well, I do have a good one. The mic is coming to you.
Dan, I was thank you for this, by the way. I was curious just because you talked about Keaton really pushing the idea of his films like not being interpreted. Like this is everything that is up there is on a screen, which, as you point out, is exactly like the opposite of what a critic does. Were there a moment or films where you felt inclined to want to respect his wishes, or was that something you kind of struggled with writing the book?
Oh, not wanting to overinterpret, you
Yeah.
mean?
Or like, boy, Buster would, if Buster could read this, he would just be like.
I mean, I don't think it kept me. I'm a critic, so I can't help it. Like, I don't think there was a moment that I thought I'm not going to interpret this because he wouldn't like it. But I certainly often felt, I mean, and I think this about all the reams of scholarship that have been written about him in a way that he probably wouldn't care about very much of any of it. You know, he might be happy for the publicity, and he does kick off his memoir, his autobiography, by saying something nice about Bob Sherwood. You know, something that Bob Sherwood said about him, where he compares his face to Lincoln and says it's one of the great American faces. And he starts off with this sort of abashed tone of like, well, that was an awful nice thing of him to say, or something like that. But He also says somewhere, and I think this is quoted in the book, he says, I grew up reading notices and vaudeville papers and things like that, and this critic likes you and this one don't, so that's that. I think he was pretty indifferent to discourse about his movies and was kind of bemused in general by like intellectual gabbery. Like when his wife Eleanor read Waiting for Godot, because she read all the scripts that he was offered before giving them to him, she was sort of like his reader, to let him know whether it was something interesting. He was offered a part in Waiting for Godot, a perfect part for him, Lucky, the character who's brought on stage, with a rope around his neck and barely says a word, and then at the end has this kind of nonsensical discourse. It would have been an incredible part for him. But Eleanor read it and said, this makes no sense. I have no idea what this is about. And so he didn't do it. So there are moments where it's sort of like, if there had been somebody in his retinue who had maybe had a little bit more education and had seen how, as you were saying, the highbrow and the lowbrow come together perfectly in him, he might have had the chance to do that role, and it might have kicked his career off in a whole new direction.
We have 2 questions from the YouTube watchers. Do you want both at once, or should we do one at a time?
I'm afraid I won't remember the first one anymore.
I think you'll remember both of these, but I'll do one at a time. Lori Jensen writes, do you see similarities between Keaton's transition to MGM on one hand, and on the other, modern independent filmmakers, quote-unquote, selling out to studio system? Could he have continued on making his own movies without a major studio?
Mm-hmm. I mean, the answer to question 2 kind of answers question 1. Like, I don't think it can be seen as that analogous. I mean, if there was somebody who knew more about the industry and how independent film works now, maybe they'd correct me. But he didn't really have a choice in a way. I don't think you can think of it as selling out exactly, because it was just the direction that the economy of film production was moving in at that moment. The transition from silent to sound, and I hadn't really realized this until researching it extensively, was so violent. It was an incredibly violent period in film history, and as a result, in a lot of people's lives, in all of these whole fields and careers that had existed for decades because of film suddenly ceased to exist. For example, musicians, who were like orchestras and pianists who accompanied films were suddenly out of work, and musicians' unions were in a complete tizzy because they couldn't get jobs anymore. So that's a whole career that disappears at that time, And film theaters had to be rewired for sound, which was a hugely expensive undertaking. So there was a long period where Hollywood was desperately churning out these sound films that everyone wanted, and most theaters in the country couldn't show them and were trying to get bank loans in order to show them. And meanwhile, the Depression was starting, so they couldn't get the loans. And it was just a brutal time. And so lots of careers, not just Keaton's, were very negatively affected by it. So the reason he moves to MGM, and this is like, it can get covered in more nuance in the book, but it wasn't because he sort of decided, I want to make more money now and work for this studio. It was more like, independent production is not viable anymore as a model. Your producer is dropping you and all of his other independent companies that he finances, and you need to be placed, in some kind of contract player position at a studio. And he was placed at MGM, which was the probably most successful and poshest, like the softest landing place he could have gotten. But it still turned out to be a tragedy for him because they just didn't understand his comedy and gave him no freedom to create it.
Again, I defer to the room if there's a question. All right, and so we'll go to that another question from the YouTube audience, which is, by the way, loving this session. Yay, YouTube audience. Rich Madden writes, I was surprised to read that Buster had his father in his films. How did Buster and his father rekindle their relationship? I'm up to chapter 22, says Rich in parentheses. Sorry if you explain it later in your great book.
Oh, thank you, Rich. I don't remember what chapter 22 is. I would need the chapter title to know what's happening there. But yeah, his relationship with his father and his whole family's relationship with his father was complicated because there's that big break moment that I talk about in 1917, which is even more dramatic than I described it. I mean, they literally leave him drunk at a theater door with his trunk, and they just take off without leaving him a note or anything. But his parents never lived together again after that, I don't think, as man and wife, but they reconciled to the extent that they saw each other. Eleanor Keaton, Buster's widow, talks about how his father would come over for holidays or dinners or things like that. His father also stopped drinking sometime in his, not exactly clear when, but probably sometime in his 50s. He hooked up with a Christian Science lady, as they called her, who didn't believe in drinking. And so he got sober and I think became a more together and happier person. So yeah, he would often play small roles in Keaton's films. He plays his own father in one early film called Neighbors, and he often shows up as some sort of vague, he's one of the Union generals in The General, somebody from the other side. And you can always recognize Joe once you know what he looks like, because he had one specific trick that he always did called his hitch kick, where he could kick really high, and so it was something he used to do on stage a lot, was kick the hats off guys' heads and things like that. So if you know that Joe is in a movie and you want to see who he is, just watch for the tall, rangy guy who at some point, does some kicking stunt, and that's Joe. But it seems like by the time Joe died in 1946, they were reconciled. They weren't estranged or anything like that, but he was much, much closer to his mother as an adult, and in fact lived with his mother for long stretches as an adult, whereas his father was kind of doing his own thing.
Emily, back to you for more
Right.
questions
Yes,
for a few minutes.
Sure. So I guess I'm interested in, we've talked already about Keaton's resistance to interpretation and resistance to interpreting his own work. But I thought it was also a really interesting theme in your book that it was possible for him to be misinterpreted and to be very angry and unhappy about it. And that part of what happened with MGM was that the whole nature of his comedy was misinterpreted. And so I sort of wonder, what was going on with that? Why was he misread? And also, did he have a sense that there's something wrong with how they're seeing me or how they're seeing my character type? Mm-hmm. What was the right reading?
He certainly had a sense.
Yeah.
I mean, if you read his memoir, he says over and over, this was the wrong vehicle for me. I should never be in a forest. They should not have picked this property. I begged them not to do it. I mean, I think, even though he was not analytical, he was kind of a critic in the sense that I think he grew up seeing all kinds of entertainment, right? I mean, he grew up as a child watching everything from juggling acts to bicycle stunts to elephant, whatever. I mean, he had a broad sense of what entertainment was and what worked on stage and on screen. And he knew that what was happening at MGM was, a miserable place, not just for him personally, but just that he was producing miserable movies. But because those movies did well financially, which is, I think, one of the most humiliating things of all about that period, it's not like he was a broken down drunk making terrible movies that were failing. He was a broken down drunk making terrible movies that were succeeding, which must have just been an extra twist of the knife of humiliation. But it kind of is a mystery to me why they had such a hard time finding vehicles for him. It really makes the creative team at MGM look extremely disconnected from what they were doing. Why did they hire him? Why did they think he was funny? To hire someone and then just so completely misunderstand what kind of things to put them in and sort of how to further their career. It was almost as if, I say this in the book, if there had been a team of people specifically designed to sabotage his career at MGM, they could not have done a better job than the things that they chose to put him in, which interpreted all of the greatest strengths of his performing persona as weaknesses in a way. I mean, the side of him that was always kind of the schlemiel, the little guy who was getting picked on, they sort of turned it into, that he was a patsy, like he was a dumbbell who was, kind of getting beaten up by people. And they're really painful to watch because he is sort of like a rag doll. And in one movie, Free and Easy, that I write about, plays a literal marionette. He does a dance on strings, and it's just, again, such a perfect metaphor, although nobody engineered it to be a metaphor for what his position was at MGM at that time. So I can't point to any one villain and say this guy or this team of people didn't get him. Certainly Irving Thalberg, who was, very powerful producer there and who wanted him at MGM, thought he was hilarious. He thought The Cameraman, the first movie Buster made at MGM, that was very much a him kind of movie, that very much flowed from his sensibility, was hilarious. And The Cameraman was shown, I write about this too, for decades at MGM as a model of what a comedy could be. So even after he had been fired ignominiously and had long left the company, when they hired new gag writers, they would say, "We'll show you a funny movie, The Cameraman." And when we watch The Cameraman now, it's missing about 3 minutes of footage because MGM wore it out. They wore the printout from showing it so many times. So there's just a lot of cruel irony in there. And some of it, I guess, just has to do with changing tastes in the time of the Depression. And sound comedy was very different than silent comedy. And people wanted verbal gags. And, it was suddenly a different style and people's tastes had changed.
I mean, I guess I'm thinking about partly about the why was Keaton never in the father role thing, and relating that to how his name as the Patsy guy was Elmer, but then he gives that name to his dog, and he's sort of the loving father to the dog, and it still seems as if he's sort of trying to create some different relationship with this self that's become. The mistreated dog can be the beloved dog.
Yeah, the Elmer thing is very curious.
Yeah.
And I wanted to have, this was a chapter that sort of fell by the wayside because I could never quite figure out how to frame it, but I wanted to have a whole chapter about Keaton and animals because he loved animals in his personal life. He made a lot of movies with animals, right? And the cameraman, he has a monkey that rides around on his shoulder for part of the movie, and he has a whole film called Go West that's just about his love affair with a cow, basically. Like, he doesn't want this beautiful cow to be slaughtered, and so he does everything to keep her from going to the slaughterhouse. Yeah, so animals were very important to him. Wait, now I've lost my train of thought. What was your question?
My question was how does his naming of the dog
Oh yeah,
relate to
Elmer
this
the
whole-
dog.
yeah,
Right.
Yeah.
So Elmer is the name that MGM slaps on all of these Patsy characters that he plays. As soon as I hear his name is Elmer in a movie, I get depressed because I know it's going to be one of those movies that makes him look like a dumb rube who doesn't know anything and he doesn't get to do any stunts or anything. And yet his beloved St. Bernard that he owned when he worked at MGM, he named Elmer. And years later, when he got a second St. Bernard, he named it Elmer 2. And he wanted to name his next St. Bernard Elmer 3, and his wife laid down the law and said, I'm not naming any more dogs Elmer. But it must mean to me, that must mean either that he had some lingering affection for that character, or maybe, because he had a dark sense of humor, maybe it was a kind of a cruel joke. You know, like I was the mascot of the studio, you know, so now my dog is named Elmer. I'm not sure exactly. But yeah, it's one of those mysteries where it's sort of like, who can understand the mind of Buster Keaton? He was a very strange man. And after spending all these years studying him, although I feel like I'd love him, you know, as much as one can love a person you never knew who's long been dead, I don't understand him. You know, I still don't understand much about his psychology or the choices that he made.
Emily, we have a question here from Nate.
Nate.
Thank you. This has been wonderful, first of all.
Thank you.
And I have so many questions that have to do with this conversation, but I can't wait to read the book, so I'm going to pause on that. This is about presentation and sort of the reception of these films. I've seen screenings, you know, of Buster Keaton films with live, you know, accompaniment by people like Bill Frisell or, you know, improvisers who've done things. And I wonder what for you has been the most effective or aesthetically pleasing or rewarding kinds of musical accompaniment to his silent films, because there's such a range, and I wonder just what has affected you most.
Oh, that's such a good question. And it's very timely because over the last 2 months of promoting this book, I've seen a lot of different kinds of live musical accompaniment. And some of my favorite things I've done has gone to screenings where somebody is either playing piano. It's all been keyboards so far at this thing, but not always piano. Some people have, you know, an organ synthesizer where you can do all kinds of crazy sounds. And I just saw the General accompanied by Jeff Rapsis, who's, you know, part of this. There's this sort of, you know, underground mafia of like silent film nerd accompanists who are just so great. They know so much about the music of that time and the films of that time. And the way he did the General was with all kinds of sound effects, you know, so he was doing train whistles and, you know, like chug chug sounds and, you know, obviously incorporating musical themes, but really improvising, which is the way you mostly would have seen it at the time. You know, a few big movies, like if it was a roadshow movie like Birth of a Nation or something that was just, you know, a big event sort of movie, it would have a composed score to go with it. But most of these were just musical cues that some guy at a piano was weaving together, or a woman at a piano was weaving together to accompany. Yeah, what's my favorite that I've seen? I like that Bill Frisell score a lot. But I don't think he does it live. I don't know. I think it's just on a DVD. I think it would be fun to hear a full orchestra, and I have never heard that. But I think my favorite way to hear music with a Keaton film is basically, yeah, somebody who loves silent film, who has some sense of historically how it was accompanied. And they're not necessarily aping that exactly, but they're doing something similar of watching the movie and making it up as they go along. And there was something else I was going to say about that. Now it left my mind. But, all right, if I remember it, I'll tell you after.
Yes.
What I was sort of curious about is, did Buster Keaton have any relationship with cartoons? Strong opinions? You just see so much like nth degree abstraction where he pushes the limits of reality, and the next step is a cartoon. Did he hold opinions on it?
I don't know that he talked about them much, but this is another chapter that fell by the wayside. I thought about writing about the growth of the comic strip, the newspaper comic strip at the turn of the century, because that also almost completely accompanies his childhood. I think that maybe the first Hearst newspaper that ran a comic strip was 1903 or something like that. So he would have been a young child growing up and like reading the funnies. And in fact, when he was in his teens or so, his father, Joe Keaton, got offered. Some film producer came to him. I think it might have been Hearst, William Randolph Hearst, who was, his papers had some of the first funnies in them. And they wanted them to do Life with Father as a movie, which was this long-running comic strip that had a part that would have been perfect for Buster, of this sort of layabout son, the kind of rich twit that he played sometimes, like the guy who didn't know how to do anything. There was a character just like that would have been perfect for him. And the dad was a sort of Irish drinker that would have been perfect for his dad. It was a great casting idea that the three Keatons would do Life with Father. But Joe Keaton turned it down because he hated the movies at that time and thought, they were taking over vaudeville and they were just the useless flickers. He had all kinds of scorn for them. So that never happened. But I'm sure that Keaton was a reader of the funnies. I mean, there's a couple of anecdotes in his personal life, like in his date book, which you can go look at the Academy Museum, where all his papers are and stuff. He would draw little cartoons sometimes. And I think that those cartoons, these little kind of stick figures that he drew, were based on, I'm not going to remember the name of the guy at the time, but they were based on a comic strip of the time. He would sort of copy those little figures. And then there's a stop motion animation moment in one of his movies in The Three Ages. There's a moment where he's a caveman and he rides on a dinosaur, and the dinosaur is sort of a stop motion, like Gumby dinosaur. And it's kind of oddly out of keeping because he didn't use a lot of camera effects like that. But I can't imagine that he wasn't somebody who read the funnies, and was kind of aware of their importance in culture.
I have a question. Those of us who listen to the Slate Culture Gab Fest have heard you, not too often, but often enough, refer to the making of this book along the way. And I have the impression that you feel it's a really hard thing to do, to write a book. And I think those of us who've written books totally agree. It's a really hard thing to do. This is an obvious question, but I think we would really benefit from your response to this. So you write relatively short pieces. You write them on short deadlines. You're really, really good at it. The film reviews are amazing. And this is a totally different thing. There's not even, one is A, the other is Z. There's not even like some gradations to this. So I guess one of the questions I have here is, now that you've done this and you obviously loved the experience, though it was difficult, I guess you're a book writer and you're just going to keep doing that again and again and again. Yes?
Al, I would think that you, of all people, would realize how violent it is to ask a person promoting their very first book when they're going to write another book.
Violence in the question. I guess it's a way of saying, praising you, and the book is so great, and I guess it's time for another one. Anyway, what is that next book going to be?
I mean, okay, I'll get there in a minute, but first, just about the difficulty of writing, I would say one thing I know there's at least one other critic in the room that, yeah, it is strangely, it's not at all unusual when writing a Slate review that I will sit down and write 1,000 words in, not one sitting, but certainly in a day. Yeah. I have to review this movie. I have to be done with the review by 3:30 p.m. or whatever I've agreed to. And whatever I have now on the blank page, it's somehow going to be 10,000 word formed essay by the end of the day. And so countless times over the years of writing this book, I asked myself, why can't I just do that now? Why can't I just write 1,000 words a day and then I'll be done in a year, or less? But the fact is, of course, that when you're writing something that is dependent on what came before and needs to lead to something afterward and is dependent on research and you have to stop and look up a fact every 2 minutes, of course you can't write that quickly. It would be an incredible day if I got 1,000 words a day written on a book. So the rhythm of writing it is just very, very different. And God bless people who actually are just, churning out 1,000 words a day, but I was never able to do that. And there were countless depressing days where at the end of the day I had fewer words than I had at the beginning of the day. And the book was getting smaller and smaller. So, yeah, definitely much, much harder than I thought. but much more rewarding than I thought, you know. And really, I mean, with all love to Slate and the joys that I've had writing on movies there, like the best and most rewarding experience I've had as a writer, especially when it comes to the reception. Like, it's just sort of amazing that I now have this thing called a book, which, you know, to me when I was growing up, that was the ultimate. You know, movies are great and TV and music are great, but like the ultimate cultural expression really is just a bound codex book, you know. So the fact that there is one that I've created, that now people are somehow experiencing the thoughts that were previously in my brain being transferred to their brain, that's still kind of astounding to me and wonderful.
So part B of the question is about academia, because you're a survivor of academia, or survivor is the wrong word. You went there.
Survivor's fine.
Okay. And you
house
produced a
collapsed and you
book that
survived.
is got all of the rigor in thinking and structure, as Emily was pointing out, just the most interesting way of doing it. But it isn't academic in the negative sense of that word. I guess there's many years of buffer between the academic experience and this. And there is something back there about your feelings about academia in this experience of writing this book that is really everything you probably imagined you would do when you were, you know, in a doctoral program or whatever, but without all the trappings and the difficulties. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I guess you could say by writing a dissertation, I had already had the experience of writing something like a book, and that was hard too, but that was very different because I only had to please 5 people. You know, I didn't have to think about there being an audience and the book actually selling. But there's no way that I could have written this book without all the experiences I had in grad school, you know? So if any of my old professors are listening, they should feel, you know, I feel grateful to them for giving me an ability to read that I think is what informed the book, you know? But yeah, I'm not quite sure I have a real answer for that because I was already well out of academia by the time I started writing the book. So I wasn't really thinking about it either way. But it did sort of feel like, you know, now you have to step up to the plate. Whatever you've thought, whatever you've read, you know, all of the, you know, knowledge or preparation you've done so far now has to come fully into play in writing this book. So I guess that would be the relationship between the two. Thank you. Emily, we have time for one more question. Is it yours?
I think somebody else from the room who hasn't spoken should ask one. Yeah. Here you go.
How was Buster Keaton affected by like other comedians of the day, like Harold Lloyd and Charlie Chaplin?
I mean, now we think of them as such rivals, and you know, we like to rank them against each other and picture them as these guys who were fighting for the slice of the same pie, but they didn't really perceive themselves that way at all, I don't think. I mean, for one thing, they were just in a constellation of many, many more comedians and, you know, other kinds of actors, and probably saw themselves more as competing for market share of the movies than, you know, comedy itself. But also, I just don't think that Lloyd or Keaton ever thought of themselves as rivals for Chaplin in any way, because he was so incomparably much more famous than they were, much richer than they were, much more prestigious than they were, you know, and he was really somebody who had, for one thing, kind of invented global fame in a way, you know, along with Pickford and a few others, a few years before they got into it. And secondly, just was so catapulted into the stratosphere of, you know, someone who was recognized all over the world and received by princes and kings everywhere and, you know, had more money than God. Like, he probably seemed to them like not even an aspirational figure, but just sort of, you know, he's Chaplin and then we're over here doing our thing. So it was much, much later, really, that there started to be any sense of pitting them against each other and you pick your team. They weren't personal friends, any of the three of them, but they weren't enemies either. And Keaton did tell a story that when he was on the verge of signing with MGM and about to make what he called the greatest mistake of his life, that both Chaplin and Lloyd came to him and said, "You shouldn't do this. You shouldn't sign this contract because, you know, you won't be able to trust your judgment and they won't listen to you," and all the things that did end up happening. But of course they were in a position to say that because they both were good businessmen, unlike him, and they owned stock in their companies, and Chaplin owned his own studio, and they were able to keep on in the sound era doing what they wanted to do for a while at least. Whereas he was really, I mean, this passive side of his character I was talking about, he really was being sort of buffeted about by the winds of change at that moment and didn't have a lot of choice in what he did.
Thank you. We have on the other side of this wall, we have a yummy reception, food and wine. So we hope that you will hang out. And Dana, I'm calling it audible here. I wonder if you would be willing to do the book inscribing in the room there. We'll find a place for you so that people can meet you as you know.
Sure, you
so
mean
that
as
you're
opposed
not,
to at the table.
as opposed to sitting here when everybody else is having a reception in there.
Sure, as long as I can have some snacks and wine while I sign.
That's exactly it. So we'll join you in the other room. There are books to buy there, food there, and most importantly now, we need to thank Emily Wilson, not only for this wonderful hosting job, but also I think this was kind of your idea. The whole thing was so.
We planned it about 2 years ago.
Yeah,
Oh
no,
my
I was
God.
going to
Oh,
say
really?
it was right before the pandemic we were going to do this, but
Yes.
it wound up being great
This is
because
better,
now the
'cause
book,
is
exists.
out.
Yeah.
So Emily Wilson, let's thank Emily. And Dana Stevens, whose book is just marvelous. So we will see you in the other room. Please hang out with us. Thank you again.
That was awesome. We got to everything pretty much, right?